Hey class, today we're going to go over alternate parties. We've spent a little bit of time on the two-party system, but what about alternate parties? Why doesn't America have more choices? And that was very prevalent in the 2016 election, where both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were, in many ways, the least liked general candidates of an election ever. And that begged the question, why don't we have more choices? Well, today we're going to get into that a little bit more. So the first reason is, in some ways, comes down to what the two parties have done. Due to the rules put forth in elections by the major two parties, it's really hard for any alternate party or any party outside the Republican or Democratic platform to win an election. That's because both parties have made it law in many states that you have to have so many signatures to even get on the ballot to vote. There's the issue in presidential elections that you have to have at least 15% of any poll uh, of, that more or less says that people will vote for you to get in the debates, which leads to less of an opportunity for them to get their views out. And more or less, the third parties have election law against them, and that's because, in many ways, there's been a bipartisan effort, and when I say bipartisan, I mean Republicans, Democrats, to make sure that they don't have a role in the process. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But for the most part, they see them as a thorn. They don't see them as beneficial. For the most part, they see them as a threat to take away votes. And this happens numerous times. So the Democrats, for example, in 2000, um, there was a major party. There was a major third candidate in the name of Ralph Nader, but he probably took votes away from Democrats, which gave Republicans the vote. Um, so that's a fear there. Uh, Secondly, third or alternate parties tend to be more focused in their goals and demographics. They tend to go to the fringes of society for the most part, and therefore it's really hard for them to win a plurality of the votes. We've got to remember that that's a key part here, that once you have 51% of the vote, it's even if you had 40% of the vote and the other party had 36, you win the seat. We don't have proportional representation. It's a winner-take-all system. That's not to say, however, that even though it may be difficult for third parties to win, that they haven't had uh, an influence in American politics, and many of their policies have been adopted by the major third parties. So Theodore Roosevelt, for example, um, was originally a Republican, but he formed the Bull Moose Party, which came to be known as a progressive party, and had many significant impacts like the 8-hour workday, child labor protections, um, and other things. We'll talk about those a little bit later in the lesson. But recently, there have been elections around the world where different ideologies and candidates outside the mainstream have gained traction and following. So Marine Le Pen in France, for example, was seen as a nationalist candidate, but she was really running outside the two major parties, but she ended up losing. But she was in a similar vein to, in some ways, on the same platform Donald Trump was running for, a very nationalist, um, isolationist agenda. In many ways, the current president, especially during the 2015-2016 primary race, could have been seen as an alternate candidate. But it's important to note that he still ran under as a Republican, even though he had many ideas that were, in many ways, against Republican ideals and conservatism that the Republican Party had drafted itself into. Bernie Sanders, as well, um, so far is officially an independent. He's not officially a part of a party, but he had to run under the Democratic platform uh, for any hope of actually getting into election. And currently, he caucuses or sits with Democrats in the Senate. So, even though in many ways he doesn't identify with Democratic platforms, again, that's one reason why there was the question of can he get a plurality of votes in the general election? And the same with Donald Trump. Like I said, each candidate was either seen as an outsider or they had to run under the major political parties in order to win the election. Bernie Sanders had to run as a Democrat to even be on the stages with the debate. Otherwise, he would have had to wait to the general election. And Donald Trump had to run as a Republican. So let's spend some time, since people were looking for other choices a couple years ago about this election. What are the other choices that people have in the United States? Well, the first is the Libertarian Party. They're currently the third largest party in the United States, and they have some ability to pull people from different walks of life. So they believe the government should be as limited as possible. The idea of libertarian comes from the idea of liberty, which means hands off or free in some ways. Um, Free to learn, free with knowledge, and they believe the government should be as limited as possible. In other words, there should be essential responsibilities only. So there should be little involvement in business. This helps pull people that would be economically conservative. The government should have little involvement in social issues. So it's common for libertarians to support things like gay marriage or legalization of drugs, or even in some cases, um, restrict laws or abolish laws that force you to wear a seatbelt, because they don't think the government should have any business telling you what you do in your car. They also believe that there should be little involvement in foreign affairs, so there shouldn't be any foreign aid. We shouldn't be in other countries. Um, we should more or less have a small defense force to protect ourselves and nothing else. Um, However, they also believe in things like free speech and freedom of religion. Um, so in our recent I know in the recent religious freedom unit, if we talk about the right of people to discriminate based on religion, well, the Libertarian Party would be okay with that, because they believe that's a business decision and capitalism should um, make the change, not government. There's also the Reform Party. The Reform Party tends to be a little bit more conservative, but emphasizes fiscal responsibility in all aspects of government, including the military. This would be something that would differ from the Republican Party in some ways, where they want a very strong defense or are willing to spend billions of dollars on it. Um, they would also say environmental needs have to be balanced with economic needs. So uh, if we want to tax carbon, for example, we want to make sure that that does not at least hurt businesses, even if it would save the environment. Lastly, the Green Party. They also ran a candidate in the 2016 election in the form of Jill Stein. They're big proponents of social justice and equal opportunity. This is different than necessarily fairness, but it's the idea that everyone should have equal opportunity to money, and the government should correct that if need be. It also would mean that there's a diversity in numerous fields of government. Um, in some ways, this is more about power than it is about fairness. Um, they're non-violent groups, so they would be, for the most part, opposed to many wars. They believe in personal and global responsibility, but they more or less see government as an age of change uh, in forcing these things out. So if people are too rich, they would see the government as taking more money. If they would see one group dominating over the other, it would see a government as the agent to change that. The interesting thing is they don't accept donations from corporations or political action committees, and we'll get into that in our next unit. But more or less, this in some ways goes back to the populist movement, in that they want businesses free from the political process, and in some ways that can be a good thing. So we'll talk about that in our next unit. So the Green Party tends to be more left-wing. Um, if you took that political ideology test and you were far left on many things, the Green Party might be for you. So if third parties haven't won much, what have they done? Well, the most successful was the populist movement in the early 20th century, which included parties like the Progressive Party and the Socialist Party. And the Populist Party, in many ways, actually won seats in Congress. So it was probably the most successful. They didn't win a plurality of seats in Congress, but they won seats in Congress nonetheless. Um, and they promoted things like the use of national currency as opposed to bribes, the use of national transportation, such as development of the railroad and infrastructure, highways, promoted the idea that labor unions should be able to meet and collectively bargain for wages, child labor laws, food and health safety laws, the creation of national parks, which we have a picture of Bryce Canyon below. We're also big in women's suffrage, getting women the right to vote, um, the era of prohibition, and subsequently the income tax. But we're also big on immigration restrictions. So in some ways, a nationalist um, agenda when it comes to who can be in the country. So not great on in the area of diversity, respecting diversity, but many of these ideas, even though the progressive, the Populist Party did not won many seats or some seats in Congress, they still didn't have enough power in many ways to affect change. However, many of these ideas were adopted by the Republican and Democratic Party, and today these are things that we hold dear and most people would not want to get rid of. So in other words, we actually want to protect children, and therefore we most likely want to keep laws in place that do so. We wouldn't want to go back to that time. But lastly, is the third party a wasted vote? Well, this is a tough call. Third or alternate parties are never likely to win enough elections to control Congress or the White House. Remember, we're in a pluralist election country. So if you win a majority of the votes, you win the seat. You're not sharing power with anyone. In the eye of the two major parties, they are a thorn because they can take away votes from their party. So the two major parties, in many ways, collaborate to make sure that third parties are not going to get a seat at the table, and there's that's unlikely to change as the two major parties control government and the lawmaking process. However, they do influence policy, and many people do influence third parties or alternate candidates in many ways do influence the party themselves. We saw that with Bernie Sanders, for example, where the Democratic Party actually had to adopt some of his principles to get some of his voters. So in some ways, it's not a necessarily bad thing. The question is, are they a wasted vote? Well, depends what your objectives are.